Chapter 4. I pulled the blanket up and flipped over, trying to find some way to get comfortable. I should have taken David up on his offer. His bed had to be more comfortable than this. Sleeping on a bed of nails would have been more comfortable than this. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to will myself to sleep. I'd woken up time and time again, tossing and turning and worrying. It was hard to sleep in a strange place at the best of times, and this was not the best of times. My eyes would open, and in the darkness, I'd try to figure out where I was. It would take a few seconds. Strange bed, strange house, strange sounds. The sound of water. My head was filled with images of water. Rain, the raging river, the flooded roads. Things I'd seen, but also images of things I'd heard about. Flooded underpass. Cars stalled out. Downed wires. My father in his black slicker in his tow truck. The McBrides trying to get home. Not tonight. No one was getting here tonight. I didn't know what time it was. It might have been midnight, but it might have been 2 a.m. I tried to look at my wristwatch, but it was too dark. The flashlight. Where was it? Oh yeah, I'd put it on the end table in the corner. I threw my feet off the Chesterfield, and they splashed into freezing cold water. I screamed at the shock and jumped up at the same time. There was water halfway up my calves. I sloshed over to the table, grabbed the flashlight, and turned it on. I swept the light around the room. There was water everywhere. The whole house was flooded with a foot of water. There were things, a doll Susie had left on the floor, a slipper, pieces of wood, a kitchen cupboard door, floating through the room. I took a few steps towards the front door, water sloshing up as I walked, then stopped and turned toward the phone. I had to call my father. He'd know what to do. I stopped. Of course I couldn't call him. The line was dead. Regardless, I picked up the phone, praying for a dial tone. Silence. I heard a noise behind me and turned. David was standing on the stairs in his pajamas, shining a beam of light across the floor. What used to be the floor. I splashed over and climbed the stairs and stood beside him. "Oh my God," he whispered. It's everywhere." He let the flashlight play around the living room. It was strangely reassuring to know that somebody else was seeing the same thing I saw. A second set of eyes witnessing it made it seem real, not some sort of strange dream. "The television!" David suddenly yelled. He pushed by me and jumped, landing in the water with a tremendous splash. "What are you doing?" I screamed. "Get back up here. Are you crazy?" "The television! We have to save the television!" "The water is still below the tubes. We can save it if we move it right now. You have to help me lift it up," he yelled. I looked at him. He was standing in over a foot of water inside his house, getting ready to lift the television. "That's crazy, David. We have to think about what will my parents think when you could have helped save the television, but you didn't. It's worth a lot of money. Help me," he pleaded. He sounded so desperate and genuine. Besides, what was it that I thought we should do instead? I stumbled over icy water splashing up my legs. "Lift up that side," he ordered. "We'll put it on the kitchen table." I turned off my flashlight and slipped it into the pocket of my skirt. He placed his flashlight, still on top of the television. "And be careful when we move it. We have to keep it flat so the flashlight doesn't roll off." I bent down slightly to get a better grip, and the freezing water hit me higher on my legs. "Lift on 3, David said. 1, 2, 3. The television set came up and out of the water, dripping wet. It was as heavy as it looked, but I had so much adrenaline surging through my body, I thought I could have lifted a car. David backed toward the kitchen, pulling the television and me with him. The flashlight wobbled as we moved, but didn't fall. The table was higher than the bottom of the television, and I strained to get my end high enough. We thumped it down. It now stood more than 2 feet above the water. We both stood and stared at it for a few seconds. "What do we do now?" David asked. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. I had no idea. "Do you want me to try to save something else?" "No, I mean, do we stay here or wake up Susie and try to get out?" "Out? Out there?" I said, gesturing toward the window. "Yeah, maybe we should try to get up the valley." "I don't know," I said. "Let's look outside." I pulled out my flashlight and turned it back on. Carefully, I moved toward the living room, following the beam of light reflecting off the water. My eye was caught again by more and more objects floating around in the house. I bent down and picked up Susie's doll as it bobbled about in the water. I tried to aim my flashlight through the front window, but the light just bounced back off the glass and I couldn't see anything. "Let's open the door and look out," David said. I felt a rush of panic. The door was protecting us, but then I realized that it was doing nothing. It wasn't holding back the water. The house was full of water. David struggled to open it. We stepped onto the porch. David was just in his pajamas, and neither of us had a coat or shoes. The sky was still dark and ominous, but the rain had definitely slowed down. Despite everything, I was relieved. The worst was probably over. This was as deep as the water was going to get because hardly any more was falling. We shone our lights into the night. They managed to reach the houses on the other side of the street, where we could see in those narrow beams froze my soul. All of Raymore was underwater, including the front lawns of all the houses we could see. The river had reached out and engulfed the whole street. There had to be 3 or 4 feet of water. We were in the middle of the river, and we couldn't even see the shore. The water was surrounding the houses on the far side of the street, the side away from the river, or at least where the river was supposed to be. From those houses, I could see lights, flashlights and candles, flickers and pinpoints of lights. I felt a little better. We weren't completely alone. I also heard voices. I couldn't make out words, but there were people calling out in the dark, calling for help. "There's a car on our lawn," David said. The words sounded so casual. My beam spun to meet his. There was a dark-colored sedan sitting on the corner of their lawn. The water was almost up to its windows. A terrible thought raced through my mind. Was it the McBride's car? And if it was, where were they? Were they trapped inside? Had the storm taken them away? Or had they come home and gone to bed so quietly that I hadn't even heard them come in? Were they upstairs right now sleeping? I could go and wake them up, and Mr. McBride would know what to do. I wouldn't have to be in charge, and "It's the Watson's Chevy," David said, "from next door." "But why would they park it on your lawn?" "Maybe they couldn't get it into their driveway. Or it's moving," David gasped. Before our eyes, the car started to shift. From a fleeting second, I thought somebody was driving it, but then I realized that the car wasn't moving forward or even backwards. It was moving sideways. It was being pushed down the street, down the river, and it had just come to a brief stop on their lawn before the current caught it again. I turned as it drifted, a slow circle. I kept my flashlight trained on it. The light caught the side mirror and bounced back to me eerily. It continued to spin slowly as it drifted, and then it simply disappeared from view, pushed along the street and around the corner. "There's somebody in the water," David screamed. My head spun around faster than my flashlight, and I followed his beam, bouncing out over the water. There was something bobbing and weaving, racing along in the current, mostly hidden beneath the water. It was somebody caught in the current. No, it wasn't a person. At least not alive. There was somebody. It was a cow. The black and white markings were visible above the surface. It was a dead cow being pushed down the river, caught in the current, moving at a tremendous pace, being thrown about like a rag doll. It must have come from one of the farms north of Weston, caught and dragged downstream. Our flashlight trapped other objects in the current. Tree branches, pails, and garbage cans, pieces of wood, things we couldn't make out, mostly submerged, and more dead animals. A little herd, 3 drowned sheep, raced down the middle of the street, being tossed and turned head over hoof as they passed. "There's no way we could ever get across that current," I said, as much to myself as to David. "We could if we had a boat." "Do you have a boat?" I demanded. "We have tools and some wood. We could hammer together some pieces to make something that could float, some kind of raft, and then we could paddle across. Look at the current. It's pushing around cars and cows. We couldn't fight against it. It would just catch us and take us down the river. But if we could just get to the other side of the street, we'd be able to get out." I looked at those houses opposite us. They weren't far away, but they still were on the other side of the current flowing down the middle of the street. Then I thought about the lights coming from those houses, and I suddenly understood. They can't get out either. Even if we could get over there, we'd still be trapped. We have no choice. We have to stay here. This is our island. An island that's sinking. Not sinking. Flooding. We just have to head to higher ground. Come back inside. It was bizarre to step into a house filled with water, but as David closed the door behind us, I felt safer. We were in a flooded house, but it was still a house. Safe as houses. We stared up the stairs and I stopped. It wasn't just the first step. The first two were underwater. Even though the rain had slowed down, the water was still rising. The butterflies in my stomach started fluttering again. I counted the steps. There were 12, 2 below water and 10 above. 10 steps that separated the top of our island from the flood water. My whole body was shaking. Was that from the cold or because I was scared? Probably both. There was a loud crash and the whole house seemed to shake. I looked all around, playing the light in one direction and then another. I couldn't see anything. All I could think was that the kitchen table had collapsed and the television had splashed onto the floor. What was that? David asked. I shook my head. I thought it was the television falling. No, I don't think so. It was like something hit the side of the house. He splashed off the step and through the water. Reluctantly, I stepped into the water once again and trailed behind David. He was trying to see out a little window at the side of the house. It's a truck, David said, his voice almost a whisper. We've been hit by a truck. What in the name of goodness was he talking about? I nudged him aside so that I could see. I gasped. There was a big panel truck pushed up against the side of the house. It had been carried down the river, and now the current was trapping it there. David started giggling. I looked at him as if he were crazy, and then I realized that the whole thing was crazy. We were in a house filled with water in the middle of a river that used to be a street, and the house had just been hit by a floating truck without a driver. I stiffened. It was abandoned. It didn't have a driver, did it? I trained the beam of the flashlight onto the cab of the truck. At first, the light was reflected back by the windshield, and I couldn't see anything. I changed the angle slightly, and then I could see inside. It was empty. Nobody in the driver's seat. Nobody in the passenger seat. I couldn't see the back of the vehicle, but there was nobody that I could see. And even if there had been somebody in there, dead or alive, what was I supposed to do? We were powerless to do anything except sit and watch. That thought stuck in my mind. We weren't the only ones who were powerless. Everybody was powerless. Nobody could fight against the storm. Nobody could stop the force of the water. What was happening all around us was something that no person could stop, something that all of the people of Weston, all the people of Toronto, all working together couldn't stop. All we could do was wait it out, wait for the water to flow away, for the level to drop, for the current to slow, wait to be rescued. And until that happened, it was my job to keep David and Susie safe. I'm going to check on Susie. She's fine. I know, but I still want to check. I also wanted to get out of the water, get to higher ground. Slowly, I waded across the room and climbed the stairs. It felt good to get clear of that water again. I reached down and rubbed my legs. They were so cold they were numb. I could hardly feel my feet at all. My shoes. Where were my shoes? Were they underwater behind the door or had they floated away? Did shoes float? I jumped back into the water. I had to find my shoes. They were almost new and my mother had spent a lot of money on them and she'd kill me if anything happened to them. I bent down and felt around in the water behind the door. They weren't there. I played the light around the room. There was so much floating around it was hard to pick out. There! I spotted one of my shoes floating, like a toy boat. I sloshed over and picked it up. Water drained out of it. I kept looking. One shoe wasn't much use without the other. There it was, in the corner, floating in a little fleet of household objects. I grabbed it. I found my shoes. My mother wouldn't be mad at me. Then I froze. What would my mother be thinking right now? Was she asleep and unaware of what was happening to this house? Or was she standing up on the edge of the valley, looking down, terrified, worried to death about me? And what about the McBrides? Where were they? What were they thinking right now? I just wished I had some way of letting them all know we were okay, that I was doing my job and taking care of the children. My shoes and I mounted the stairs again. I stopped a few steps up and thought about putting them on, but decided I might as well carry them. Susie's room was, of course, dark. I raised the flashlight just enough to see her without disturbing her. She was sound asleep, the covers pulled up tightly so that only her face was visible. Daisy once again curled into a little ball on the foot of the bed, lifted her head slightly and looked at me. Her fur had dried, but the corner of the bedspread was damp. Her little nubby tail wagged happily. Both the dog and Susie were blissfully unaware. Ignorance is bliss. That was another thing my Nana used to say. Satisfied that Susie was safe, I decided that David should come upstairs too. I headed back down the steps, but stopped partway. David was still fishing things out of the water. For some reason, my shoes had seemed important, but what he was doing seemed ridiculous. David, just leave it alone. I can't just stand here and do nothing. I have to try to do something. I didn't want to go back in the water, but I knew I was going to. Even if I thought it was pointless, I couldn't let David work by himself. I was in charge, and I had to help. I took a few more steps down and then slipped and fell. I bumped down the last few steps and landed in the water. I jumped to my feet, completely soaked and freezing. In one hand, I still held my flashlight. Despite the dip under the water, it was still working. But I dropped my shoes. They were floating away in front of me. I reached down and grabbed them again. What happened? David seemed angry. He had probably been as startled and scared by my fall as I'd been. I must have missed a step or something. I looked back at the stairs. They looked shorter. That didn't make any sense. I counted down from the top. There were only 8 steps above the water. I looked down. The water was above my knees. It had suddenly gotten deeper, much deeper, almost a foot deeper. I looked at David and then caught sight of movement in the front window. I did a double take. It was water, waves slapping against the glass, and as I watched in the beam of light, I could see that the water was rising as I watched. It was like looking at an aquarium being filled up. David turned his flashlight onto the window too. As the water rose, the glass seemed to be bulging inward. I stood there, frozen in place, icy water halfway up my thighs, memorized. And then the window shattered and exploded.